These GPUs are not even remotely the same size and do not draw even remotely the same amount of power. They're coming from different generations. Why am I comparing them? Because they cost the same, and until AMD releases something from the 7000 series in the $600 price class, all I can do is look at the actual market, what sells for around $600, the RX 6950 XT, at least in the United States. I realize around the world, markets might be different. The RTX 4070 has just launched at $600. I would imagine the Founders Edition will be available for that price. We'll see for how long, and then we'll see what the partner cards are actually available for as well. Anyway, just to show you that it really is, like, I could go buy a 6950 XT for $610 right now with that promo code at Newegg. The model I'm testing in this video is the XFX Speedster Merc 319 at $650. I'm running it at its out-of-the-box settings. Same with this one. I do have Smart Access Memory and and ResizeBAR enabled. Let's hop into the benchmarks and give you a whole bunch more final thoughts at the end. Right, let's start our benchmarks with Unreal Engine 5. So many games in the upcoming near future will be Unreal Engine 5 games with features like Lumen and Nanite and virtual shadow maps, all making for an excellent engine, but right now all we have to test is Fortnite because it's developed by the developers who make the Unreal Engine 5. Anyway, in this at 1440p epic settings, we are seeing the RX 6950 XT ahead by 12% in average frame rate and 17% in the 1% lows. The RTX 4070 is averaging a little over 60 FPS, and the 6950 XT is closer to 70 FPS, although currently at 69 nice FPS. And so it is definitely a win here, although we can see some other stats up there. Do you see the wattage on the top line near the right, but not the fan speeds, the one to the left of that with the little W? Yeah, the 6950 XT is drawing over 300 watts, and the 4070 is under 200. So that is a massive difference, and that is definitely something that people would need to keep in mind when buying these GPUs. Now, also there's ray tracing performance. So Lumen is a software-based ray tracing system, but it can be hardware accelerated, increasing its accuracy, but also taking a bit of a performance hit, although not a massive one. This is the 1440p epic settings with hardware accelerated ray tracing turned on, and now we're seeing the GPUs basically tied. The 6950 XT is still slightly ahead by 2%, you wouldn't really notice it. 1% lows by 7% would still be pretty hard to notice, but maybe more noticeable. And again, they're both averaging pretty close to 60 FPS, although the 6950 XT is just a bit closer. Dropping down to the high settings, you can see that these GPUs are capable of delivering a high refresh rate 1440p experience in Unreal Engine 5 with very good settings. It's just that the epic settings are extremely demanding. Here we're seeing the 4070 around 100 FPS, a little bit less. With the 6950 XT over 114, 115 FPS, it ends up being an 18% average FPS lead for the 6950 XT, although the 1% lows are a 28% lead, which is a bit more noticeable here. So it seems like at the lower settings, we're seeing even better results for the 6950 XT. Now moving up to 4K resolution at the epic settings, we see a 9% lead for the 6950 XT on the averages, and a 12% lead in the 1% lows. Neither GPU is absolutely crushing it here or anything. So 4K epic settings in Unreal Engine 5 look like they're going to be incredibly demanding. And I doubt by the end of the this GPU generation that Fortnite will end up being the most demanding game at 4K epic settings in Unreal Engine 5. We're basically looking at low 30s versus mid 30s. Anyway, we could use DLSS upscaling on the 4070. This current build of Fortnite does not feature FSR, but it has Unreal Engine 5's TSR, which is a similar temporal upscaling super resolution technology, both at the quality setting here, which is a 1440p baseline resolution, and trying to reconstruct a 4K image. I do think the image quality of DLSS does look better than TSR, and the GPU's performance is tied now. Literally the same average FPS and a tiny 3% lead in the 1% lows for the 6950 XT, but again, an image quality lead for the 4070, although that did have ray tracing enabled in that test, explaining why they were more tied. Dropping down to 1080p, if we look at the Epic preset without hardware acceleration on the ray tracing, we are at a 13% lead for the 6950 XT and 23% lead in the 1% lows, with the 6950 XT just averaging a little under 100 FPS, with the 4070 more in the mid-80s. So they're both able to do high refresh rate 1080p gaming at the Epic settings in Unreal Engine 5, but they're not... I mean, they're performing so well here, I guess, is what I was going to say, that we could have some headroom to enable ray tracing. So if we turn on the hardware accelerated ray tracing, we now see the 6950 XT drop to only a 3% lead and a 13% lead in the 1% lows, which is maybe a bit more noticeable. So honestly, don't take too much of this game as a ray tracing benchmark. We'll look at some heavier duty ray tracing later in this video. But it is really nice to see that the Lumen hardware acceleration isn't really too demanding, and it does bring these GPUs pretty close together in performance. Now, in this video, I really want to focus on the latest games as for most of the benchmarks, and The Last of Us Part 1 has been giving a lot of people trouble, but a large part of that is due to VRAM. And the 4070 does have 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so here at the 1440p Ultra settings, it has enough VRAM. And so, GPUs that don't have enough VRAM would be really struggling here, but both of these are actually performing well. And actually, the 4070 is 9% ahead of the 6950 XT in the averages and 8% ahead in the 1% lows. Now, by moving up to 4K Ultra, we actually see the 6950 XT pull ahead, although I would still call this basically a tie. It's a 3% lead on average FPS and tied on the 1% lows. So not that big of a lead. Also, I think the 4070 is actually spilling over its VRAM capacity. If you look at the usage on the 6950 XT, it's at about 13 gigabytes, and the 4070's system RAM usage is higher, indicating that there's spillover from VRAM into system RAM. By dropping down to 1080p Ultra, this is further confirming that I think that the 4K results, the 4070 was held back by its VRAM spillover, because at 1080p, where neither GPU, like even the 6950 XT, which has 16 gigabytes of VRAM available, is only showing 10.5 gigabytes of actual usage and 11 of allocation, we see the 4070 actually ahead by 27% here in the averages and 7% in the 1% lows, 21% in the averages. So good results here, very good for the 4070 when it's not held back by any VRAM spilling over. Now, another very recent game that's giving a lot of people trouble is Resident Evil 4 Remake, which at the max preset on PC does include some light ray tracing workload. And a big part of the problem people are having in this game, though, is once again a VRAM issue, and the 12 gigabytes of VRAM does seem to be enough here. The 6950 XT is using 12, and they were basically tied in performance there. Now, when we go up to 4K max preset in this game, you can see the 6950 XT is using closer to 13 gigabytes, which the 4070 doesn't have. And now we're seeing a 23% lead for the 6950 XT in average FPS and 24% in the 1% lows. So this indicates that at 4K here, the 4070 probably could have performed a little bit faster if it had a little bit more VRAM, or at least that's how I would interpret what I'm seeing there. Especially because by dropping down to 1080p, we're once again seeing the GPUs delivering very similar performance on average, 2% lead for the 6950 XT, and a 9% lead in the 1% lows. Now keep in mind this is a ray tracing workload, however it's a light ray tracing workload. Again, we'll explore ray tracing throughout this video, but you'll see that in the lighter ray tracing workloads, the AMD GPUs fall off in performance relatively, but not massively. Whereas in heavier ray tracing workloads, we would see a larger drop-off. Now, I think the best looking recent game is A Plague Tale Requiem. This game from Asobo Studios using their own in-house engine looks amazing, and at 1440p Ultra, the 6950 XT is delivering 13% faster average, 14% 1% lows, both GPUs delivering over 60 FPS though, so good to go on 1440p Ultra here. This is a game that doesn't worry about old generation consoles, it's just the current gen PS5, Series X and S, all of that. By going up to 4K Ultra, this pushes both of these GPUs hard. Neither one is delivering anywhere near 60 FPS, but the 6950 XT is leading by 15% on the averages and 13% in the 1% lows. There's not a huge amount of VRAM usage in this game unless you turn on ray tracing, which I'm not doing here. I'm just going with the Ultra preset. The game did get patched quite a while after launch with some ray traced shadows, which aren't part of the Ultra preset, so I didn't enable it, and honestly, I'm not that impressed by ray traced shadows. 1080p Ultra, we're seeing the 6950 XT only leading by 8% and 6% in the 1% lows. Both GPUs are delivering over 100 FPS much of the time, and at least over 80 or 90 FPS almost all the time. So at this point, they're both just doing a good job. Fairly similar performance with the 6950 XT ahead. Also, the lower the resolution goes, the more you can run into system, like other parts of the system, bottlenecking performance. Now, looking at Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 at the 1440p balanced preset, not the extreme preset, because it's a competitive game, people would usually turn down settings, so I think it's a more realistic test. We're seeing the 6950 XT actually leading by 28% here and 27% in the 1% lows, delivering around 200 FPS with the 4070 closer to 150 FPS. Both of them doing extremely well, but this is certainly an outsized advantage for the 6950 XT. And by going to 4K resolution, that advantage is pushed even further with a 35% lead in the averages and 33 in the 1% lows. And it's basically, 125 FPS versus, 92 FPS much of the time in the benchmark run. So both of them doing well. And I'm not sure how many people are playing, focused on competitive games on a 4K screen, but you might, not exclusively play competitive games, have a 4K screen, but still want to play them sometimes. Anyway, dropping down to 1080p balance, which I think is a reasonable thing to look at. People might buy high-end GPUs to focus on competitive gaming here. We see 6950 XT leading by 24% and 26% in the 1% lows. I will mention that Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 does seem to favor AMD's architecture over Nvidia's architecture. It usually does kind of have a bit of a better than average result relatively in this game. Now, Forspoken is maybe not super popular, but it is a demanding PS5 exclusive on console that it has a PC version, which we're looking at here. I went with the highest preset, which does include some ray tracing. Here we're seeing the 4070 4% ahead, which I could basically call a tie. The 1% lows were kind of disrupted by the fact that this benchmark run has load screens that destroy the 1% lows while it's loading, so we won't really look at that here. Moving up to 4K, we're actually seeing the 6950 XT ahead, this time by 5%. But again, I think anything within 5% is pretty much a tie. You wouldn't really notice the difference while you're playing it. Other than I will point out the power draw once again. 300 watts versus less than 200 watts is a pretty big difference. And so there is always that. Now, dropping down to 1080p, we're really seeing basically a tie here. It's a 1% lead for the 4070. Both of them delivering good performance. So once again, we're seeing a game with a fairly light ray tracing implementation, bringing these GPUs to basically a tie, similar to what we saw in Resident Evil 4, as long as there were no VRAM issues, and in the Lumen hardware acceleration that we saw in Unreal Engine 5 with Fortnite. Now, moving on to Unreal Engine 4, we're looking at Returnal, which is at its 1440p epic settings, giving a 20% lead to the 6950 XT and a 5% lead in the 1% lows, although both GPUs are delivering excellent experience here. The 4070 is only a little bit under 100 FPS average, and we got a 115 FPS average for the 6950 XT, which means these GPUs have some headroom for 4K. At 4K, the 6950 XT is winning by 18% in the averages and 15% in the 1% lows. The 4070 is averaging a bit under 60 in the mid-50s, and the 6950 XT is averaging in the mid-60s. So both of them giving a good experience here, but one of them's, averaging over 60 FPS and the other one isn't. So certainly something to take note of if you're thinking about 4K gaming on these. Let's move into a different Unreal Engine 5 game. And so, sorry, not Unreal Engine 5, geez, Unreal Engine 4 game with the Callisto protocol. I think this is the best looking Unreal Engine 4 game I've seen. It's a pretty recent one. This is the game's built-in benchmark, and it is very demanding on the 1% lows. So yeah, those are pretty bad. 10% lead in the 1% lows for the 6950 XT and 18% lead overall in the average FPS. and both GPUs delivering a good average FPS with, around 100 on the 6950 XT and in the upper 80s on the 4070, both of them with bad 1% lows. But like I said, this benchmark run in this game just crushes 1% lows on like every GPU. Moving up to 4K Ultra, we are seeing a 23% lead for the 6950 XT in the averages and a 19% in the 1% lows. The 1% lows are just bad overall for both of them, though, and if you look at that frame time graph, it is not very smooth on either of them. That being said, the 6950 XT is able to average closer to that 60 FPS mark, with the 4070 way more noticeably below it, closer to the 50 FPS mark. In the easier parts of the benchmark, it does bring the average up a little bit. But definitely a noticeable win here at 4K for the 6950 XT, coming in at quite a bit of power draw, though. Dropping into 1080p Ultra, we're now seeing a 17% lead for the 6950 XT, and in both the average FPS and in the 1% lows. Monitoring the GPU utilization, I feel like you do see the 4070... I was going to say, I thought I saw it drop, a little below 100% in a couple of spots here, more so than the 6950 XT it does. Like you saw it right there going through that corner. It's not enough to affect the results too much overall. But it is noticeable that when you do hit a CPU limitation at really high frame rates, Nvidia usually gets limited at a lower mark because I think their driver overhead has more CPU overhead. That's just a little side note while we had time to talk about it. No, God of War is not quite as new as some of the other games we were looking at here, but I wanted to test a DirectX 11 game. Everything else we've been looking at is DirectX 12. Here we see 6950 XT winning by 17% in the averages and 25% in the 1% lows, although both of them are delivering over 100 FPS average. So both of them delivering an excellent 1440p experience here. And once again, the main reason we're looking at God of War is it as our DX11 game. Moving up to 4K Ultra, we're seeing a 13% lead in the averages for the 6950 XT and a 13% also in the 1% lows, with the 4070 averaging around 69 FPS, nice, and 77 FPS on the 6950 XT. And so, yeah, both of them delivering a very good 4K experience in this game as well. So, if you're thinking about the 4070 for 4K, it's certainly something you can consider. We saw in the latest titles, though, that it's certainly going to be struggling. But there's definitely games like this where it can deliver a great experience there. Moving down to 1080p, we're seeing a 17% lead for the 6950 XT on average, but a 33% in the 1% lows. I'm curious if that's at all affected by any kind of CPU limitation or overhead. Just because we're at such high frame rates now, that it's more likely that the rest of the system could start to introduce some issues, especially in the 1% lows. But anyway, let's move on to a Vulkan game. So I wanted to look at Red Dead Redemption 2 running in the Vulkan API, again, because not everything's DX12. So we got some DX11 with God of War, some Vulkan here, 22% lead for the 6950 XT on average. I'm not calculating the 1% lows on my Afterburner stats this time because this game has really long load screens during its built-in benchmarks. So I'm just using the built-in benchmarks average reported FPS here for this game. Now, moving on to the 4K max, we do see the 4070 over 60 FPS much of the time, with the 6950 XT closer to 80 FPS or more much of the time. Both GPUs delivering a very good 4K experience at the maximum preset in this game, with a 21% lead for the 6950 XT over the 4070. So definitely a win here. Once again, not tracking the 1% lows, just using the numbers from the end of the benchmark run to compare average results. Dropping down to 1080p, it is looking like the GPU utilization on the 4070 is sometimes a little bit lower than what we're seeing on the 6950 XT. So once again, I'm curious if we're seeing a little bit of CPU limitation entering the numbers here at these high frame rates at 1080p. But anyway, based on what we've got, we do have an 18% lead on average for the 6950 XT. at 1080p maximum preset in this game. So great results overall at all resolutions, honestly. They were all very playable in Red Dead Redemption 2. Let's move on to Cyberpunk, and I'm going to mostly use this as a 1440p ray tracing benchmark, but I did want to show its results without ray tracing enabled at 1440p before we did that, where we see the 6950 XT with a 24% lead on average, 22% in the 1% lows, the 6950 XT averaging around 100 FPS, with the 4070 averaging closer to 80 FPS. So it's important to note that the 6950 XT has this higher baseline performance by 24%, because when we enable ray tracing, the 6950 XT drops performance at a higher rate than the 4070 does, bringing its lead down relatively. But you can see at ray tracing low, the 6950 XT actually still has a 10% lead over the 4070 and a 9% lead in the 1% lows, both GPUs delivering a very good experience here. And while I'm using the ray tracing low preset, I am turning off the upscaling that it enables by default. So this is native 1440p ray tracing. The low setting, though, like I said, it's just the local shadows, no sun shadows, no bounce lighting, no reflections. So it's not the most impressive ray tracing implementation, but both GPUs are giving a high enough frame rate here that you could consider enabling it. But like I said, by enabling ray tracing, the AMD GPU lost more performance relative to the 4070, but still has a lead. So we're going to look at the medium ray tracing next, and you'll see that the gap continues to change here. By going to the medium preset, once again adjusting it back to native resolution though, we're seeing the 4070 leading by 15% on average and in the 1% lows. Both GPUs are struggling now, although not unplayable, with the 4070 in the mid-40s in this bar scene and the 6950 XT more in the upper mid-30s. So neither GPU delivering an amazing experience with this level of ray tracing at a native 1440p. Of course, upscaling is available, and we will test that when we look at the Ultra preset. Now, the ray tracing medium keeps the local shadows, and it adds in sun shadows, and it adds in some of the bounce lighting, although not pushing it as far as it could go. And I'm not even talking about RT overdrive. But more meaningful ray tracing here than what we saw at low, and that does bring the 4070 ahead, like I said, by 15%. So we can see the heavier the ray tracing implementation, the more the AMD GPU's performance falls off, and so it not only loses its lead, but then starts losing by a wider margin the heavier the ray tracing gets. By going to the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, not to be confused with the Ray Tracing Overdrive preset, which is a path tracing that is even more demanding, we see the 4070 ahead by 35% on the averages and 36% in the 1% lows. So this is definitely showing how big of an advantage you can get the heavier you push the ray tracing. However, that being said, the 4070 is struggling here. It's only averaging in the upper 30s, and the 6950 XT is only averaging in the upper 20s, so it's certainly more playable on the 4070, but these kinds of frame rates aren't really the experience I think most people are looking for when spending $600 or more on a graphics card. The Ray Tracing Ultra preset here adds in RT reflections and bumps up the lighting to have, to the Ultra setting, but it also has the local shadows and the sun shadows. So a lot of ray tracing going on with the Ray Tracing Ultra here, even though we're not doing the RT overdrive. Now, because frame rates were low, a lot of people, when you push a heavy ray tracing workload, are going to want to upscale in order to help make up for that performance loss. So the 4070, I'm using DLSS quality, and on the AMD GPU, I'm using FSR2 quality. They both render from the same base resolution and try to output a 4K-like image, although I think image quality-wise, DLSS does a better job. It looks a little bit sharper, looks a little bit more like native, although FSR2 quality is usable and looks pretty good. Now, when I'm comparing the performance number here, I'm comparing those without frame generation. The 4070 is 28% ahead, in the averages 24% and the 1% lows. You can also enable frame generation, pushing it over 100 FPS, but look at the very bottom of the screen where it says average PC latency. Notice that there's increase to the latency when you enable frame generation, whereas usually when you increase frame rate, latency drops. So there's some downsides to frame generation, but watch my full video on frame generation for more info. So which one should you buy if they cost the same? And I do hope they end up actually costing the same and that the 4070 actually does sell for around $600. We'll have to see what happens. I wouldn't be surprised if they sell out at launch at that price, and then hopefully they do come back in stock at around $600. I would love to see them at $500, but I don't think we'll be seeing that anytime soon. Anyway, but the point is, if these do actually end up costing the same on the actual market, which one would you buy? I have a feeling the comment section on this video is going to be very entertaining to read if you like that sort of thing. Because I actually think there's an argument to be made for both of these GPUs. And I think a lot of you were going to expect me to just say the 4070 is slower and costs the same, buy a 6950 XT. Well, first of all, what case and power supply do you have? Is your case even able to fit a 6950 XT? Most of them are huge, and the 4070 is actually a reasonably sized dual slot 2-fan cooler and can fit in almost anybody's case. Also, what power supply do you have? Because your power supply might not actually be able to support a 6950 XT, but almost everyone's power supply is going to be able to support an RTX 4070. If you haven't actually built your PC yet and you're building new right now, you could take those things into consideration, but buying a larger case and a bigger power supply, well, those might actually just help future-proof your build and better longevity overall. Anyway, that can add upfront cost to the build, making them maybe not actually be costing the same, right? So in other words, some people should just buy the 4070 because you literally can't fit a 6950 XT in your case or support it with the power supply. Also, I think some people are just interested in energy efficiency, their overall power bill over time and all of that. So maybe even if you could support it and run it, running at well under 200 watts usually while gaming versus well over 300 watts usually while gaming is a noticeable energy difference, and some people are definitely going to factor that into their buying decision. In addition to that, let's talk about features. The 4070 is from a newer generation of technology with some newer features. We have things like AV1 encoding, which is going to matter to some people, but for straight up gaming, AV1 encoding is not relevant. But if you stream your gaming, record your gaming, that kind of a thing, do some types of video production, all of that, then AV1 encoding could matter to you. If you are gaming, then frame generation might matter to you. Frame generation, I think, is really cool, and I game on a 4090, and there have been times when I've even wanted to use frame generation on my 4090. I liked it in Plague Tale Requiem quite a bit. I've been playing with the RT overdrive mode in Cyberpunk, and frame generation is a great way to make that a lot more playable of an experience. Don't confuse the frame rate numbers in frame generation to normal frames. 100 FPS using frame generation does not feel the same as 100 FPS without using frame generation, but it looks about the same. So it really does help your motion fluidity. And if you have a high enough base frame rate, it still feels pretty good. It looks a lot smoother than if you weren't using it. And if the base frame rate is high enough, there's usually not a lot of visual artifacting that's noticeable because the difference between the two frames that it's kind of generating a frame between is small enough if you're at a high enough frame rate that there's not a lot of artifacting going on there. So I think frame generation is very interesting technology. And while AMD will probably eventually release an FSR 3 that will probably support the 6950 XT, that is not something that's out yet. We don't know how long you'll have to wait, and we also don't know how good it will be. So there's certainly things going for the 4070. There's a case to be made here. Also, you do have productivity applications. There's a lot of productivity apps that are, just designed for the larger market share, which is Nvidia. So depending on your workflow, you need to look up, like I'm not reviewing all the productivity apps in the world in this video, I'm focusing on gaming, but if you use your GPU for more than just gaming, you should look at the apps you use in your workflow and how well they support AMD versus Nvidia. Many apps work great on AMD, but there are certainly some that barely work at all on AMD and are just programmed with Nvidia in mind. There's a lot of AI workloads, things like that, so stuff to consider. That being said, there's a big case to be made for the 6950 XT as well. It has more VRAM, We didn't see that causing a lot, being much of an advantage in our testing here, but we did actually already see it become a bit of an advantage, at least, in Resident Evil 4. I think when we were running at 4K at the maximum preset, I think the outsized advantage there for the 6950 XT was a direct result of it having more VRAM. And so 12 gigabytes VRAM overall, I think especially if you're playing at 1440p, isn't really an issue right now. The fact that we're already seeing some games pushing right up against that limit does make me think that in time, maybe even just in a couple of years, the time you would still own your GPU that you're buying right now, you know, games tend to use more VRAM over time. That is just always the case. And so if there's already games bumping up against 12 gigabytes at 1440p, then over time, I could see it more likely that you'd have to reduce settings or suffer the consequences of spilling over the VRAM. So certainly something to think about. 16 gigabytes of VRAM is more than 12, and I do imagine that within a couple of years, we will already be seeing more and more examples, although certainly not in every game, where that becomes an advantage. The 6950 XT is also just straight up faster in non-ray tracing workloads, and because it's faster in non-ray tracing workloads, in almost every example that we saw at least, then when you do enable a light ray tracing workload, the AMD GPU falls off a larger fraction of its baseline performance, but because it started ahead, it can become at least tied, if not still a little bit ahead of the 4070 with light ray tracing workloads, which is stuff like what we saw with Lumen, with hardware acceleration, things like that, and many of the other games with the lighter ray tracing workloads. But we did see that when you push the ray tracing workloads a lot harder, the 6950 XT is certainly slower than the 4070 at heavy ray tracing workloads, and the heavier the workload, the larger the advantage for the 4070. If you're going to upscale to try to make up for that gap, in other words, you turn on ray tracing, a lot of times you also turn on upscaling, then even when you're not enabling frame generation, which is not really upscaling, when you're upscaling with DLSS super resolution, you can upscale with FSR2 as well, but I do think DLSS looks better than FSR, especially if you use it at its more aggressive settings, and I've reviewed this in other videos, so have other channels. It's definitely the case. So the 6950 XT has its advantages in speed and VRAM, but other than that, the 4070 wins in features, energy efficiency, and depending on your productivity workload, it's going to win there. So I think rather than me telling you which one you should buy, I told you the situations where each one is better. And I'm going to go ahead and let all this arguing take place in the comment section, because I know it will. There's going to be people saying that you would be absolutely stupid to buy a slower 12 gigabyte GPU when you could buy a faster 16 gigabyte GPU, and they certainly have a point. And there's going to be people saying that buying a Nvidia GPU with better features, better productivity workload support, less VRAM, but still a lot with 12, and things like frame generation and better ray tracing workloads and all of that. They're going to say you're stupid if you buy the AMD GPU, and they have a point. They both have a point. You guys argued out in the comment section. Have an excellent day.